Very good afternoon to you. Welcome to this session, which is a thematic parallel session, and this is on disaster mitigation and management. And we're going straight into the panel discussion, and we have with us this afternoon Bhagatan Sri Dr. Jemilah Mahmood, Senior Research Fellow of King's College London, as well as Senior Fellow of Khazanah Nasional Berhad, Malaysia. Also, Professor Meen, Chhetri, the President of Nepal Center for Disaster Management of the Democratic Republic of Nepal, and Mr. Jehangir Malik, OBE, UK Director of Islamic Relief, United Kingdom. And to moderate this session, we have Mr. Sanaka, Samarasinha, Director, Global Center for Public Service Excellence, UNDP, Republic of Singapore. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite the speakers as well as the moderator to take their positions on stage. Silakan.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me say thank you to the organizers for an excellent conference, and also for giving all of us the opportunity to talk about a subject that is very dear to our hearts, certainly to all of those of us who are on the stage here, and I'm certain that it is of great interest to all of you. It's going to be a bit of a challenge this afternoon. First of all, it's not always the best thing to have a session after lunch, a very nice lunch at that. So I hope that we will all keep you awake to start with. Secondly, some of us are somewhat challenged in terms of height, and these chairs tend to make you sink even further. So I hope you can at least see us from where you are. But also, more importantly, these chairs are very comfortable, so I hope we don't fall asleep as well. That said, it is, of course, a great pleasure for me to be here on this stage with a very illustrious panel of speakers. What we intend to do is to take about 10 minutes for each of the three speakers. We will go one after the other, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, comments, any observations, stories that you might like to tell us related to the subject. Of course, as all of you know, the subject is about disaster, about mitigation of disasters, about management of disasters, and specifically the role of the private sector in disasters. The 21st century has been really one where disaster has been something that's been on everyone's mind. It's not necessarily something that we all wanted to think about, but it's happening all the time. As you know, right now the Philippines is dealing with one. Not too long ago, I was in New York, and everyone there was dealing with the aftermath of Sandy. Just in the last decade, there have been over 4,000 disasters recorded. And I say recorded because there are quite a number that I suspect minor disasters which may not have gone recorded, but nevertheless cost lives and money, assets. But just in terms of those 4,000 disasters, over 2 billion people have been affected, and economic losses are somewhere in the range of $960 billion US. In 2011 alone, natural disasters caused a record US dollars 366 billion in damages and 29,782 fatalities in 302 disasters. It's mind-blowing, the figures. So then the question is, why don't we all think about disasters? Why don't we all prepare? Why are we not looking at reducing the impact, reducing the risks from disasters? Why is it only that we expect governments, or traditionally we have, governments, humanitarian organizations, NGOs, the UN and others, whilst the rest of us try to get on with our own lives? I think the argument that I would make, and perhaps my panelists will disagree, I suspect not, given that we are like-minded souls, Prevention, of course, is always better than a cure. Reducing risks may not necessarily mean that you actually will not have an event, but it doesn't become a disaster unless it actually has an impact on people. And so you can control the impact of the disaster, and you may not be able to control a natural event, like an earthquake, for example. But if you've been prepared to deal with it before the earthquake actually takes place, then it doesn't become a disaster unless, of course, people die and buildings collapse. Just in terms of money, a conservative estimate is that globally, on average, every dollar spent on disaster preparedness saves $7. That's a conservative estimate. So purely from a financial point of view, even if one isn't counting human lives, we're talking about something that actually makes sense. Now, we've increasingly begun to understand that this is not just the domain of the government, of the public sector, and humanitarian organizations. The private sector shares both the consequences of these risks and a responsibility to act in reducing them. Just think about it. In most countries, the private sector is the primary generator of GDP, employs the majority of the population, and is a dominant vehicle for innovation and investment. It also has the know-how, organization, resources, and capacity to provide solutions. This is true of any subject. Why should it not be true of managing disasters or reducing risks from disasters? And I know one of our speakers, our first speaker, will actually touch on this subject, and we can have a discussion later on. I think there is a particular role to play for companies with global operations. They may have their headquarters in places that are perhaps less prone to natural disasters, but they certainly risk disruptions to their supply chains. Take, for example, the 2011 floods in Thailand. It affected Japanese companies very badly. And so I think, again, most companies have started to think about how to reduce the impact of disasters on their own operations. Today, a few hours from now, there is a conference on the same subject, interestingly, in New York, which is convened by the UN. And one of my colleagues is moderating a panel exactly like this. There are people from Citibank, from Walmart, and a number of other companies. They have begun to realize that not only can they help by providing resources in terms of finances, but they can certainly help the public at large by providing solutions, by providing innovative approaches to managing disasters and reducing risks. Now, I want to just very quickly give you a sense of what this actually means in managing disasters. There are different stages. I mentioned that an event is an event, but it only becomes a disaster when it actually affects human lives in some form or the other. So most people think of a disaster when you see it on CNN or Al Jazeera or BBC or one of the news channels. But actually, when you're talking about dealing with disasters, the idea is to think about it long before. The idea is to consider how we reduce risks in everything that we do, whether you are talking about housing and having standards, and one of our speakers will touch on that later on, to livelihoods. How do you actually make sure that the livelihoods that you are engaging in are resilient to things like climate change? So disaster risk reduction is really the very beginning of the process. And then, of course, you have the response and eventually the recovery from a disaster. So there are different stages, and of course there are a few other interim stages which I will not go into in detail. But the point is that you can actually be engaged at any one stage, but ideally, if you are from the private sector, or from any sector for that matter, you would be engaged really from the outset in terms of reducing risks. And again, we have a speaker who is going to focus on that particular area. So I will stop there, and I will ask our speakers. We have, as I said, 10 minutes for each of them. The first speaker is Dr. Jemilah Mahmood, who's a dear and old friend of mine. We have had the misfortune of being in places of grave disasters, and I know that we are like-minded souls. Dr. Jemilah celebrated her birthday 2 days ago. I'm sure she didn't want me to tell you that, but I think we should give her a round of applause for that. But I think more than that, Dr. Jemilah has been somebody who's well known in Malaysia and around the world for her commitment to helping people. She is a medical professional. She founded Mercy Malaysia several years ago and led it for about 10 years. This organization, primarily because of her leadership, is one that has become known globally for its commitment to accountability. This is something very close to my heart as well. Many of us work in this sector, but we always lament the fact that we are not really accountable to the people who are affected by disaster. And Dr. Jemilah has led efforts in that area. She was also a very senior colleague with me in the United Nations. She's chosen to go and do something even more useful. We hope, of course, she will come back one day and work with us in the UN. She is going to speak on a number of subjects. Those of you who know her know that she's going to be provocative. I hope that you will take her challenge and respond in like fashion. Dr. Jemilah, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Sanaka. Let me start by asking all of you to look at me and tell me where's the nearest fire extinguisher and emergency exit. Did you think about it before I came up and asked you the question? Okay, I think I can stop speaking now. This is the problem, right? Because we always don't think anything will happen to you. But Sanaka is a very dear friend of mine. But let me warn you, he arrived in Sri Lanka, the tsunami happened. He went to Myanmar, the cyclone happened. He then went to Maldives, and the government fell apart. And he's going to move to Belarus, so good luck to them. So I tell you now to be warned that this man has a way of attracting unnatural things. So at least you know now where the exits are. But I also couldn't find the fire extinguishers as I walked in, so it's not clearly marked. And I think that in future, I think I would have loved to say, ladies and gentlemen, in the event of a fire or any emergency, please go this way, that way, and that. So that hopefully wakes you up a little bit. Sanaka has given a great introduction on the impact of disasters around the world. And if you actually look at statistics, less people are dying from disasters, but the economic impact is really escalating. In the last 2 years, the major disasters have actually happened in high-income and middle-income countries, which is why the economic impact is really high. Think about it. Chile, Japan, Thailand, these are New Zealand. These are all not low-income countries. And therefore, when it hits urban populations and structures that are more developed, the cost is very high. So, there is no longer any doubt that the scale, frequency, and severity of rapid onset disasters will continue to grow in the coming years at an accelerating pace, especially with the onset of climate change. And it's real. But what we don't hear about, and is equally important, are the smaller and medium-sized disasters, the floods, the landslides, that may not rob us of so many lives, but really impact lives of communities. And in developing countries, it is these smaller, medium-sized disasters that actually erode into economic gains. We know that Typhoon Bopha has hit Philippines directly, and it's really interesting that even the president of Philippines was tweeting about all the emergency numbers you can find. So if you follow him, you're actually quite interesting. Philippines is really well developed in this area, and looking at all the preparedness and risk issues in Philippines. But in 2011, we were very sad to see what happened in Japan, probably the most disaster-ready country in the world, yet hit by a terrible tsunami and followed by a nuclear incident. And not long after that, floods in Thailand. If you look at all the data coming out from this, what they call as the double disasters in Asia, it has impacted global economy, not just in Japan and Thailand. Thailand produces more than 45% of all computer parts in the world, and Japan's car manufacturing industry is well known. And the prices of computers globally have actually gone up by about 10%. So the private sector in disaster management is a topic of much debate and conversation in recent years. Disasters affect all sectors of business, both directly, as shown by the recent disasters, and indirectly. Disasters can cause operational and supply chain disruptions through physical damage to property and/or loss of critical resources and infrastructure. But they also affect the business staff and customers, both economically, physically, especially those living in vulnerable areas. There is a report called the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report. In 2011, it stated that private funding had become increasingly responsive to need relative to government resources. And private contributions grew rapidly in 2010, up by 70%, US 2.4 billion in 2009, and reaching 5.8 billion in 2010. You're talking about large numbers coming from private sector. And private giving is not something that is new, and it is, we think, probably going to increase as more and more of the donor nations facing economic crisis will actually have to cut back on their funding. But for decades, the private sector has occupied a secondary place in humanitarian relief, providing goods and services to dominant humanitarian actors, contracting their assistance. In recent times, the business community has started to respond unconventionally to needs arising from humanitarian emergencies, offering more than just logistical support or delivery of goods. But this suggests that new forms of business engagement beyond humanitarian relief may be emerging. In a future where the intensity, frequency, and complexity of crisis are forecast to grow, the private sector's role can be vital in helping to reduce the impact of risk and promote resilience. Despite the recent increase in private sector engagement in humanitarian assistance and disaster risk reduction activities, this still remains a very niche phenomenon, and collaboration among private sector and humanitarian organizations tend to be ad hoc and opportunistic. So allow me to maybe share 4 points I think we need to take away probably today from my session. Firstly, what needs to happen? We need to close the communication gap. The common speak of both the business and the humanitarian sector often mean the same thing, but expressed differently. For example, the business sector talks about business continuity, and the humanitarian sector talks about disaster risk reduction. And it's not that different. It's part and parcel of the same thing. In 2005, after the tsunami, that was when many of the agencies, both the UN, NGOs, and the private sector, and governments, of course, came together to say, we need to do something about this. We need to have some kind of framework to work around, and therefore, the Hyogo Framework for Action, named after Japan and the Kobe Hanshi Awaji earthquake in 2005 spelled out some 5 priority areas. And clearly the private sector role was also included in this. Yet in the midterm review 5 years later, we find that in the private sector engagement, we are really lacking. So there are many steps taken to improve private-public partnership and collaboration with both the humanitarian and development actors. And for example, the World Economic Forum has already established a task force to look at this, but it's still very much at discussion level. The UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, one of the Secretariat agencies, has established something called a Private Sector Advisory Group. And in national settings, for example, in Indonesia, this similar kind of advisory group has also been set up. And also in countries like Philippines and other countries, they have established many things like platforms and networks. Certainly in Malaysia, we have been in discussion with Majlis Keselamatan Negara, our National Security Council or National Disaster Management Authority, that a similar kind of platform needs to happen to bring together private sector, civil society, government, and to really address how we look at Malaysia's disaster risk and how we actually coordinate and look at working together. Perhaps it's only right in this forum that I urge the World Islamic Economic Forum to start looking at this, because the Islamic world is not immune to disasters. For the purpose of this session, we are not even talking about conflict, but that's another form of complex disasters as well, and you and I know majority of the conflicts in the world are in the Islamic countries. The second proposition is that we need to encourage businesses to look at their role in disaster risk reduction, spanning prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, beyond philanthropy and corporate responsibility. The crucial point in the case of disaster prevention that it can make communities less vulnerable to hazards and better able to build and develop. Business incentives to this are clear. Successful prevention activity will provide a more stable and predictable operating environment, reducing disaster risk to operations, suppliers and supply chains, traders, customers, and thus reinforce the company's social license to operate. Sanaka mentioned the economic case for ex-ante disaster risk reduction and management, and it's compelling. And let me repeat that for every $1 invested in disaster risk reduction, resilience prevention, you save between $4 to $7, and that's a very conservative estimate. But more than that, multinational companies with best practices in managing their property risks produce earnings on average 40% less volatile than those with less advanced risk management plans. The average property loss is 20 times larger for companies with weak physical risk management practices, while the average loss per location exceeds 3 million versus 620,000 to companies with robust disaster scenario management plans. Large businesses with strong risk management programs compared with those with weak risk management practices experience on average catastrophic losses 7 times more costly. The third proposition is we need to encourage business to do business, to make money, but to create value for communities at the same time. I used to give this analogy that when you drive down a highway, you see all the different billboards of companies advertising their goods or their products, their services. But if you look at a Formula One race car, you see everyone's logo on one car. It's about investing in something so valuable, and why is the community not as valuable as a racing car? So this whole concept of shared value is something that people in Harvard Business School, people like Porter and Kramer have been expounding, but I think we need to relook about this. I'm saying that let business do business and make profit, but let communities profit from the businesses. And there is growing recognition that the humanitarian sector and emergency situations are fertile ground for business. Profit, profiling, access to new markets. I know a friend who waits for disasters, and all he does, he packs his wife up, and they run into disasters, and then they have a mobile kitchen, and they serve the best food, because you can never get good food in disasters. And this is where the UN and all the international organizations go to. It's really amazing. So I think we are often very coy about this. We kind of feel that, it's not good to say we want to make money in disasters, but the reality is there. As the humanitarian community struggles to meet the complexities of today's disasters, I think the private sector can be an important resource to support research and innovation, to find better ways of reaching those affected by disasters or at risk. There are good examples emerging. Procter & Gamble, for example, came up with a product called Pure for water purification. Cheap, very effective. It's a business, social business, a part of social business. Arup Engineering in the UK's innovative earthquake-resistant construction has spread around Southeast Asia. And Willis Reinsurance flood risk management program in Jakarta is now showing communities how they need to invest in some form of risk insurance. And fourthly, particularly for the World Islamic Economic Forum community, it needs to re-examine and exert its role in the global challenges, including the whole spectrum of disaster management. The Islamic world is known for its role in charity and giving, either through instruments like zakat or wakaf, or bilateral assistance, and more recently increased support to humanitarian organizations and the UN. For example, Saudi Arabia contributed $500 million to Bangladesh Cyclone Cedar response, surpassing any OECD donor, yet goes unnoticed. What needs to improve is financial and resource tracking, accountability, and consequently, reporting. Humanitarian and disaster risk reduction or resilience work can position the Islamic world as a powerful force for good, both in acute and long-term situations. The management of millions of Hajj pilgrims always fascinates me, because what can it teach the humanitarian community? Maybe it can, a thing or two, about how to manage large displaced populations and applying disaster risk measures successfully. Mankind has limited ability to prevent disasters, and there are limited resources to respond to disasters as and when they occur. Thus, enhancing the status quo by relying on humanitarian response is insufficient. The scale of the challenge requires a shift from response to reducing risk and building resilience. There is also an urgent need to create capacity locally and nationally to withstand and recover from both catastrophic events and accumulating stresses. Therefore, this paradigm shift is taking place in disaster risk management in recognition of the complexity and uncertainty generated particularly by urbanization and climate change. And there is growing recognition that alongside hazard-specific measures to reduce disaster risk, more emphasis needs to be placed to task the underlying vulnerabilities and developing generic adaptive capacity to respond to both catastrophic events and accumulating stresses. The goal, in the end, that we should target is to create safer and more resilient communities that are able to adapt to changing circumstances, including being able to survive and recover from extreme events. Building resilience provides a complementary approach to traditional hazard-specific risk management that is applicable to all systems and accommodates the known and the uncertain. It is therefore particularly relevant in addressing disaster risks in the context of complex urban environments and an uncertain future. The complexity and dynamic nature of urban environments and uncertainty arising from climate change makes this necessary foresight unattainable, and unexpected scenarios and surprises may be inevitable. But more than ever, greater collaboration between the private and public sector, and for this WIEF community, the time is right for a new rethink on how funds are channeled in the aftermath of crisis towards a greater emphasis on building resilience, particularly for communities and governments to face medium-scale, frequent disasters that erode their economies, and away from the mad rush to pour aid in when CNN or Al Jazeera portrays the impact of major disasters. So that's food for thought, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jemilah. Provocative thoughts, as always, and we look forward to hearing from all of you in the audience in response to some of those propositions, 5 propositions that she made. Next, I'm going to call on Professor Meen Chhetri. Professor Chhetri told me just a little while ago, his first name means fish. Certainly the fish of the world are feeling the impact of global warming and, of course, our own contribution through overfishing. But so disaster is really something that Professor Chhetri knows very well, not just because of his name, of course. He is the president of the Nepal Center for Disaster Management. He is also an adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. He has served before this as the director of the Department of Disaster Management, as the deputy regional administrator of the chief district officer and chairman of the Disaster Relief Committee in Dading district of Nepal. Nepal, as many of you know, unfortunately, is a country which is prone to a great number of large and medium and smaller disasters with significant impact on human life and assets. Professor Chhetri has also authored a book on mitigation and management of floods in Nepal, and I think it would be, at this time, very interesting to hear from Professor Chhetri in terms of his own experience in Nepal itself, but even beyond Nepal, his observations on the role of the private sector in dealing with disasters, in preparing for disasters. Professor Chhetri, all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Assalamu alaikum. Very good afternoon. So I have a few slides here to share with you. As stated earlier, I will just share my past experiences and my feelings about disaster management system in Nepal and beyond. But I would rather like to focus more on the roles and responsibilities of private sector. In other words, we can say it CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is a neglected area indeed in many countries. If not in developed nations, it is much more neglected in developing world like Nepal. Red one? This is just to give you a very quick overview what happened in 2011 and 2012. So I'm not going to explain all these, but I believe most of you are already aware about these disasters in various parts of the world. So we are facing disasters in almost all parts of the world, including highly developed nations like USA. Last month also they had this super storm called Sandy, which affected New Jersey, New York, and other areas of the USA, and there was enormous loss of physical properties and human lives. So disasters no geographical boundary, and there is no political influence, nothing. So we have to face it, and we have to realize that we have to understand the rule of the nature. In fact, if we will respect the nature, and if we understand the rule of the nature, then we will have no disaster or less disasters. That is the most important thing, and probably most of you have heard the name of Mahatma Gandhi from India. He once told that the earth has enough to fulfill the human needs, but not the human greeds. So the problem is the greed and mismanagement. You see, we have not been able to manage the disasters. We have not been able to understand the rule of the nature. That is why we are facing the disasters. If we will respect the nature, and if we will understand the course or the phenomena of the nature, then we will have less disasters. That is the most important thing. So, here is one small text. Which one is this? Sorry. This is actually a small text from my postdoctorate dissertation. And here, what I wanted to just mention is a very simple thing, and we all know that you see, particularly in developing countries like Nepal, we have the problem of good governance. And also this disaster management field also is affected by the lack of good governance, and we have the lack of coordination, we have the lack of the resources, and we have the lack of coordination among the disaster management stakeholders, and also in other government sectors, and the government has not been able to mainstream the NGO, INGO, and other social sectors. So that is what we are feeling in our country. Maybe that is applicable in other developing countries as well, if not in developed nations. But as I stated earlier, even developed nations also are facing the effect of various types of natural and human-induced disasters. So we have to be very careful, cautious, and proactive to mitigate, to address these kinds of disasters. Okay, before I go to this slide, what I would like to here very briefly mention that as our moderator earlier in the beginning, he mentioned that if we spend $1 for disaster preparedness or mitigation, then we'll be able to save $7 in the time of disaster relief or rescue. That is very true. And particularly in the third world, in the developing countries, we are very weak in disaster preparedness. And we just, our approach is reactive. You see, whenever there is a disaster, then we go for relief and rescue and relief. So it seems that it looks like that the government or even the other stakeholders, they are waiting for disasters to respond, which is very wrong approach, whereas prevention is better than cure, which the moderator already mentioned earlier. So we have to more focus on preparedness than in rescue and relief. Of course, if there is any disaster, then we have to go for rescue and relief. That is true, but preparedness plays a vital role. So, and the most important thing for us is that we have to understand the various dimensions, like I mentioned earlier, human greed, mismanagement. All these things have created disasters in many ways. So the government should formulate, first of all, very proactive rules, regulations, policies, and has to establish a powerful agency to look after all the disasters, and the impact of disasters will be reduced. If you talk about Nepal, you see, the impact of disasters, it occurs every year, particularly floods, landslides, fires, lightning. These kinds of disasters always occur in Nepal every year. And we have the loss of human life and physical properties. And the trend is increasing. It's not decreasing. Why? Because the government regulations are not proactive. The government and even INGOs and ENGOs are much more focused, as I stated earlier, in disaster response rather than in preparedness. So we have to take into account the whole cycle of disaster management. We have to take into account the preparedness and mitigation and other things, and rehabilitation as well. And then only we can reduce the impact of the disasters. That is the most important thing, for which we are failing, I should say, so far. So now I will would like to talk a little bit about this role of the private sector. And before that, what I would like to here share with you is that there is a very famous analysis. You see, whenever there is no disaster within your community, family, or area, then you think that the disaster will never happen, never occur. But if it occurs in your area, then you think that this is, you see, the perception of the general perception of the general people. You think that, yeah, disaster occurred, but not in my house or in community, it's somewhere else. And when it occurs in your area, then you think it occurred in my neighborhood, but not in my house. And when it occurs in your house, within your family, then you think it is my bad luck. That is the misconception. That is the you see, very bad thing that we should realize it. So we should be very vigilant, very cautious. We should always think that disaster may occur anytime, anywhere. So we have to very seriously consider this thing. So regarding the role of private sector in disaster management, in developing world, it is very limited and neglected, and we have not been able to motivate the private sector, the business community, and the business community also are not highly interested because it's, I think, very logical, and it's a fact that they are not much more interested in disaster mitigation. Maybe they help in the time of of disasters for response and relief, but not in mitigation, not in preparedness, not in rehabilitation, not in reconstruction. But their approach, their contact with the consumers, with the community, and with other stakeholders is enormous. They are in touch with all aspects of the society, but they have not been, they are not interested to invest to help because they don't see direct benefit, direct profit. That is the problem. That is why we need to motivate, we need to bring them, we need to mainstream them. The government should play a vital role, and the NGOs, INGOs, and other disaster management stakeholders should try to convince them to bring into play so that they can help for the whole disaster management cycle, because they are the potential source, because they have enough resources, enough money to help in time, and that will also help for their business as well. So that is the most important thing, and we have to convince and bring them into play. So this involvement of private sector is very pertinent, very important, and we have to convince them to help in the time of disasters. And I will give you one example. Some 2 years before, my organization, Nepal Center for Disaster Management, organized a symposium for these business people. They invited business people. I mean, my organization invited the business people for an interaction program, half-day interaction program, and we highlighted their role for disaster mitigation, preparedness, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and how they can help the people in need in the time of disasters. And then, there were bankers and other business people, and some of them, they, asked openly that what is the benefit for us, because we are business people. So if there is no benefit, if there is no profit, we cannot invest. So we don't want to be in loss. And probably we try to convince them. Probably we are not able to convince them fully, and we try to organize that kind of interaction in the future as well. And still we are trying. But maybe being a small economy in Nepal, it is difficult to bring them into play. That may be one of the problems. But the fact is that they are not much more interested in playing any role for disaster mitigation in particular. So still we have to go a long way to bring them into the picture. So we are still trying. However, the impacts of disasters in all economies is enormous, and the economic impact in developed countries is high, but the human life loss in developed nations is quite low. But the human life loss in developing countries like Nepal and other South Asian countries is very high, because we are weak in preparedness. Developed countries are comparatively better in preparedness. That is the major difference. So these things we have to think and consider. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that we have to consider this disaster management as a development effort as well, because most of the development projects carried out in our country, they don't they don't consider disaster as a major component. That is the main problem. And as I mentioned earlier in the beginning, that we have the problem of cooperation and coordination among the disaster management stakeholders, and even the government, particularly the government agencies who carry out the development projects, they don't consider disaster as an important element. And that is why some development projects also fail due to landslides, floods, and other disasters. So I think if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for those interesting observations. I think it's a question that I would certainly want to pose to the audience as well. The private sector has, in fact, been lagging behind. It's beginning to get more and more involved. But the question I guess I would eventually like to ask you and others as well is, in addition to, of course, making it into some sort of an obligation, the private sector functions essentially when there is an incentive to do so. And I think we have, all of us sort of talked about the fact that it does affect their bottom line. And so the question then is, how do we actually engage with the private sector in such a way? Because I believe that the private sector is engaged, it's just that it's not always engaged in the right way or with the right partners. So it's really a question for all of us as to how we actually bring all those different partners, different actors together. But thank you for those observations. I think they're certainly very interesting and food for thought during the discussion. Next and last but not least, I would like to call upon Jehangir and Malik. Since you are in the business of talking about meanings of names, Jehangir also told me earlier on that his mother had named him as a warrior of the world, which is, of course, the meaning of Jehangir. And he was saying, well, maybe she had different aspirations for him. That said, however, you know, a warrior doesn't always have to engage in violence, and I think Jehangir, through his record, has in fact been a warrior for many peoples in many different countries in his years as a humanitarian worker. He is currently the UK Director of Islamic Relief. He has worked in a number of different countries, with different countries on disasters, including places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Balkans, Somalia, Chechnya, Iraq, and Yemen. Jehangir is also very good at raising money, as he mentioned to me over lunch. So I'm looking forward to tapping his brain to figure out how to raise more money for the UN. The UN always needs money. So Jehangir, we're looking forward to a partnership there. But today, Jehangir is going to focus a little bit on the need for risk reduction and preparedness, something that all of us have been saying, but he'll go a little bit into depth as to why that is equally, if not more important, than focusing on response and recovery. Then I think a question I would pose, but I know he's going to be talking about this as well, is how to get the private sector more involved. Does, in fact, as things stand now, the private sector actually aggravate rather than mitigate disasters in some of the things that it does? Because it focuses sometimes on the short-term benefits rather than thinking about the longer term. So, Jehangir, Malik, without further ado, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for this opportunity, and let me try and summarize and capture what we're trying to address here. And moderator and my guest speakers who've really painted a picture and elaborated where we are with disasters. And you just mentioned the private sector's involvement with the bottom line. And maybe we can start with that. What is the bottom line? And the bottom line is profit, then disaster mitigation and disaster response might be something that might not be at the forefront of the private sector. However, we've got to redefine at all sectors and all levels what the bottom line is. And if now, on that screen, I put just one image of any of the 20-odd countries that I've visited over the last 20 years. Just came back from Bangladesh. I've just witnessed the most horrific, harrowing scenes of death, misery, destruction, beyond belief that one could not even envisage that would be a reality in today's day and age, 21st century, happening in South Central Somalia, Mogadishu, East Africa. The list goes on and on and on. So why is the world just so responsive? 30-second video clip on there. I can guarantee you that everybody in this hall would be giving generously, would be giving, from their hearts, would be giving from their donations and their contributions. And that's the nature of emotional response. And having traveled to all of these countries, from Iraq to Yemen to Afghanistan, lived, slept with the people inside the refugee camps, trying to understand the dynamics of what is happening, the human reality of the impact of this disaster, be it natural, in the case of Kashmir earthquake, where the mountains came down crushing onto the people as they lay asleep at night with their children, or whether it's a natural disaster of bombs, blasts, falling, raining over their heads and so forth, the impact is the same. We, Islamic WIEF, the international NGO community, the humanitarian community, mobilizes largely into action when there's a disaster response because the world mobilizes in response. East Africa, British public contributed over £75 million within 4 weeks flat, at a time of austerity, at a time of economic downturn, at a time where there isn't money like there was 5-10 years ago. Then why is it that every emergency response that gets a high profile gets the financial response required? However, the slow onset disasters such as the Sahel, West Africa crisis this year didn't even manage to get an appeal on the screens. It didn't make it to the screen, so it doesn't get the money. But the point of all of this is that our response mechanism as a world community has to be before the disaster strikes, before the disaster is in our face, before our hearts melt and our eyes weep. Because a pound spent before that stage, am I right, is where we can have maximum benefit and maximum impact. If a cyclone was to happen right now, God forbid, again in Bangladesh, we'd need to spend over 200 to 400 pounds every month to house, to shelter, to provide water, hygiene, health, and everything that those people in sad situation that those people that are living in far-flung areas of Bangladesh. However, 400 pounds spent in disaster management would allow the people to live in a much better condition for potentially 5 years, and in a way that the impact of disaster would be far less. It's being smart with our money. It's making business decisions, being smart with a business sense. And the private sector, no one knows about business and the business acumen, value for money, and impact. So that's where I think that, as the politicians say, often when they make their political call, we're all in this together. Well, say that to a Bangladeshi child who's suffering all alone and who only people come to their attention where there's screens, videos. You know what one lady said to me in Darfur? She said to me, "I'm tired. Take these cameras away. I don't want these cameras in my face, misleading the public, thinking that you're saving us for your own benefit." It was a harsh thing. I've just come with an aid organization and I'm here to help. They're sick of it because we haven't taken the responsibility seriously enough. And where the science is there, the actual information is there to say that we need to invest in disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, and disaster management so that we don't, here's the word, and I'm not afraid to use it, waste money in disaster response, giving out handouts which won't allow people to be able to be in a better position in the long term. You need to be investing people in their infrastructure, in their resources, so that now in Bangladesh, in these areas from the cyclone, funded by the EC and funded by different donors, we built higher than the ground level where the floods come, so that when the flood, which inevitably will come again, as climate change and science is all proving. It's going to happen, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen more frequently in more areas. So that's a fact. So we have to change our business model to be able to adjust so that the disaster doesn't have the devastating impact that it's had previously. And we need the engagement of the private sector with your business acumen. We don't want your corporate social responsibility only. Bring that along. When the disaster, when I was in the borders of Libya and Tunisia in the Arab Spring, Vodafone came up. It put the mobile telecommunications, finding and all this, and British Airways and every other airline company and cargo filling and news and media and everything, and everybody mobilizes, and it's heartwarming. Please don't find this, I'm being disrespectful in any shape or form about the overwhelming response to disasters. But we can really now, in 2012, really move on from that. I think we as the aid community are moving on from that, investing into disaster risk reduction, mitigation. We're bringing media involved so that they can share this message out. And again, I use the example that we're inculcating in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and East Africa right now. The media are heavily involved, the community ownership. I've just come back from areas of Sylhet, where urban disaster preparedness with the city, with the council, with the media, and everything's involved, in which that we did a live mock drill, full-fledged, where the whole city was on fire. I mean, not literally, but, you know, a mock drill, where I was asked, pushed, threatened, forced to jump out of a third-floor building onto an inflatable, and again, preparing the community into that mechanism of being drilled into what would need to happen in a disaster. Now, some of this absolutely isn't rocket science at all. It's about being prepared and being prepared to mobilize the resources and investment before I put those horrific images to make your hearts melt and to get that money and mobilize and the action in place. Time is limited, and I'll just zone on to this. It is in the private sector's business interest, because the bottom line should be a common shared value bottom line, which is the interest of safe, secure, stable, prosperous communities. And that's demonstrated in emerging economies in countries all over the world, Bangladesh, Pakistan, in a variety of different. Some of the most prosperous, thriving business operations is in Mogadishu in Somalia right now. But if we had a better collaborated effort, we would go a lot further in helping the people in whose name that we collect and in whose name that we give. So on that, with about 20 minutes left for questions and answers, I put it out to the private sector to see how you're going to come forward with your technical skills, your expertise, and your knowledge base, your business processes, and all of what you do, which is great in the private sector. We are out here in the humanitarian field trying to serve and save people's lives. You have a business smart machinery. You merge those two together in the common interest of a safe, sustainable community, prosperous community. You have a winning formula. You keep those tracks parallel or on opposite ends on different motorways, different freeways, and only come together when it's bang on the screens. It's not going to change and it's not going to work. So I would like the private sector to put the gauntlet out to play a stronger role in forging links and forging relationships well beyond your CSR role, but to have a greater role in redefining the ethical, social responsibility of the business and the private sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jehangir. I think that was a very, you were appealing to the emotions, which worked very well. No, you haven't. In fact, you said you don't want the money, so we will happily take it instead of him, and we can give him the technology, and you can give us the money. No, I'm of course joking, and this is of course a very serious conversation we're having. And I would like to, I've got a few questions of my own, but I would like to throw it open to the floor now. If you could sort of focus on the general theme of these presentations that have been made. We've all been making the argument that the private sector has to play a more fundamental role in dealing with disasters, in preparing for disasters. That doesn't seem like rocket science. But the fact of the matter is that beyond the money, and we're talking about 2006 to 2010, there was something like 18 billion US dollars that came from private sources. And as Dr. Jemilah mentioned, in 2011, it was even in just 1 year, over 5 billion. So the question really is, beyond the money, there are lots of things that the private sector can do, and Jehangir has just mentioned a few things. The professor mentioned a few things before that. But it's not really happening. So for many of you who are from the private sector, and it would have been really interesting for us to actually have somebody from the panel who is from the private sector as well, to talk about the challenges that they have. But since many of you are from the private sector, I would actually like for you to highlight for us some of the things that you think that governments, for instance, or civil society, the humanitarian community in general, international organizations, the UN and others, can actually do to facilitate a more productive, more innovative, more creative, and ultimately more useful role for the private sector in the context of disaster management. So if you can keep that as a sort of an underlying thought, but then, of course, you're certainly welcome to ask us questions, and we'll see if the panelists can give you responses to those particular questions. I suggest we take 2 or 3 questions, comments, and if you have specific questions for specific panelists, please say so. But before you ask your question, I'd be very grateful if you would introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're from, and if you are representing some organization, please also state that. Yes, we have a gentleman in the back there, the microphone, please.
Yeah, my name is Muhammad Lakitullah. I'm from Bangladesh. The role of private sector in disaster mitigation and management. Since Bangladesh is a disaster-prone country, we have seen the efforts of the private sector is rather not coordinated, not conducive, it's rather erratic. So it is not going to help instantaneously. What I say, I think that the support of the role of the private sector should be supportive. The role of the government concerned should be the real, because they are the government of the country. They must remain always prepared for what sort of disaster management they should do. They have the logistics. They have the forces at their disposal. Private sector people does not have all the logistics and the forces at their disposal. They can give only money. I think the government, if the government of the country and the United Nations, they should have a fund and forces like that, well-trained, and they can move very quickly. That will be very much helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, should we take, yes, the gentleman up front here, the microphone.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My name is Masood Ahmed, part of the Muslim Council of Britain delegation from the United Kingdom. I also have a private business, and I have been involved with Islamic relief as a volunteer from my younger age. I would like to say that I would like to ask the panel, to what extent do you think it is necessary for charitable organizations to be transparent, to be accountable, and to demonstrate, not that they aren't, but to demonstrate value for money so that they continue to grow and develop and also continue to have the goodwill of the public, who often are the first to respond in the point or when there is a disaster. But in addition, if I may, Mr. Moderator, ask, to what extent do you feel corporate bodies and corporate organizations need to also come forward and take bigger initiatives in helping small charities develop their infrastructure, develop their personnel, and develop, as Brother Jehangir rightly pointed out, a smart approach to managing their affairs and also managing their response strategies when there is crisis, when there is disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's just take one more, and then we'll have some responses.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Nino from Bank Muamalat, Indonesia. I was in East Timor and Aceh and just recently in Afghanistan. And I wanted to particularly get Mr. Jehangir's comment on the fact that a lot of the disaster relief actually created what we call, quote unquote, an NGO economy for the local economy. And this was very apparent in Aceh and to a larger extent in Afghanistan, where I think some 80% of the businesses there were construction. And this creates a problem once the disaster relief is over, because then the local population was forced to fend for themselves. And I'm just interested to get Mr. Jehangir's idea on how to mitigate against this, or perhaps he can share some comments or experience on this. Thanks.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions and one specifically for Jehangir. It's interesting, by the way, that you mentioned Aceh and that you were in East Timor. Recently, the former president of East Timor was Ramos Horta, was at a meeting in Singapore, and he made the point that yes, there was a lot of money that was focused on building East Timor, but as he put it, and he says, I quote, a lot of money was spent on Timor-Leste, not so much money was spent in Timor-Leste. Similarly, of course, in Indonesia, in Aceh, the person who led the recovery process after the tsunami was saying to me that if they had half as much money as they actually ended up getting, they would have done twice as much work. So that is an interesting question to ask, a very valid point. But let us start, perhaps, Jehangir, with that particular question, and then the professor and Dr. Jemilah, perhaps you might also want to chip in on the other 2 questions as well.
Okay, thank you very much. You touch on, it's a very valid and very pertinent question. You touch upon something which is core to the DNA of the international NGO, the humanitarian sector. What is our role? And that's what the actions should display. They should display the core purpose, they display the core purpose of the organization. And when the disaster strikes, of course, it has a prolific impact. The humanitarian response has a prolific impact wherever the disaster may be, from Indonesia, Afghanistan. The market dynamics are always very similar as more money and more assistance is poured into the area. And managing that, I don't think the aid community has cracked it by any stretch of the imagination. It's got a long way to go. And this is, again, another area. How many of the humanitarian aid, how much of the money of the humanitarian aid response has independently, properly been evaluated? I was in front of the British Parliament Select Committee giving evidence, and a cross-party parliamentary group Select Committee was evaluating Britain's response to the Pakistan floods. I thought that was a mature way of doing it. So you take Pakistan government, you take the Pakistan officials, you take the NGO sector, you take people like ourselves on the ground giving evidence, you get the international development minister being cross-examined, questioned, and you look at it holistically. And then out of that comes some recommendations, which then are hopefully the grounds to take matters sort of forward. So the private sector, again, trying to link it back to the theme of the day here, could play a big role in the evaluation. The PwCs, the big consultancy firms could really play a big role in helping to review the monetary valuation and the impact of the value for money of such an operation. And your question about dependency, well, a vicious circle, an absolute vicious circle that seems to create a life of its own, where humanitarian aid agencies haven't been able to manage that well. And once our money runs out, we run out, we leave the people as an aid community. Well, it's questionable in what state that we leave the people. In a better position, yes, maybe from structural point of view, but for the long-term point of view, it's questionable if they're better off or worse off. And that's somebody who's primarily involved in these humanitarian interventions and so forth. So we've really got to go back and look at, you know, the modus operandi and how we operate and what we leave behind. And there's lots of heavy-duty questioning that needs to be held. And again, private sector, public sector, governments, you know, need to play a collective role in having a look at what is our impact after our departure.
I have a lot of comments, so where do I start? Maybe I start with a question on accountability. I think that when we look at accountability, let's be very clear, there's two forms of accountability. One is donor accountability, which is the easier thing to do, actually, because you can demonstrate it on your financial sheets and so forth. But probably the most important type of accountability is accountability to affected populations. What does this mean? This means that you ensure they are part and parcel of the design, the participation, that what you're giving them is really what they want and not what you think they need. And more importantly, adhering to benchmarks and standards that you set as an organization. Now, there are already initiatives. To be very honest, there are 70 initiatives globally now looking at standards, which is ridiculous. You know, one of the reasons why I had to fly in this morning is because we've been sitting down in the UK to discuss how do you set up a joint standards initiative, which means you hold organizations to account. That if you say you do the standards, how do you then measure? At the moment, there is only one organization in the world that actually certifies humanitarian accountability to affected populations, and that's HAP, and that's in Geneva. And you know what? It's not the large organizations that are being certified. It's the medium-sized organizations. You know, I'm very proud that Muslim Malaysia was the first organization in Asia to be certified and the third organization in the world. And we're not even a large organization. But, you know, taking that form of accountability seriously. Now, if I look into a crystal ball, I think that the humanitarian sector, as it is now, will be not what it is in 10 to 20 years' time. People are fed up. So I think the shift is that humanitarian organizations are moving towards ensuring resilience is in place. Now, I'm no longer with Muslim Malaysia. I can tell you what I've experienced. For example, we very quickly shifted from response only to really strengthening recovery and disaster risk reduction. So if you go to places like Aceh, there is a nursing college that has now graduated 750 nurses, rather than sending in nurses all the time to support them, but saying to the university, you need to produce your own nurses. You go to Darfur, there is a reproductive health center that's producing midwives, that's delivering all, and not a single Malaysian aid worker is there, because we believe in national and local capacity. In Afghanistan, operations have been there since 2001. And it has been run totally by local organizations, meeting women's health needs without a single threat since 2001. And you know how difficult it is to work in Afghanistan. So I think that, you know, building in that accountability to affect the populations, how will it change? I will tell you how it will change is Twitter, Facebook, SMS. The affected population is no longer a dormant group of people that sit there waiting for you to give them bottled water and mattresses and whatever. They are people who will SMS and tweet and put on Facebook that, you know what, these people are giving us stuff we don't need. It's happening. Okay? Now, in Syria, USAID, OFDA, actually came out with the thing that, oh, they've given X amount of this aid to Syria. People were tweeting, where's the aid? We don't see it. So really, you know, people are now being very cautious. If you say you're going to deliver things, especially humanitarian organizations, people are tweeting back. One of the things I do as well is sit on the grants panel of something called the Humanitarian Innovation Fund. And it's an £8 million fund now in Britain, and we give out money and grants to people to look at innovation. And the innovation that's coming out of Somalia, for example, is that giving mobile phones, cheap mobile phones, SMS platforms, and putting it on a website, Somalian communities can now decide how they want programming to be there. And what happens is that it's all so transparent on websites. The agency, which is the Danish Refugee Council, is only investing a few £100,000, say, pounds, but diaspora community, Somalians outside Somalia, are looking at it and saying, you know what, this is an accountable way of helping communities. So they are pouring in money more than the aid agencies themselves. It's going to change. In Pakistan, $1 billion was transmitted from diaspora communities. So we haven't even touched diaspora now. So, I mean, this is really going to change, and I think humanitarian organizations, if they really stick to their word, that they will work themselves out of a job, delivering assistance, and move towards really building resilience. I think that's really important. If I can just touch on one more thing, Sanaka, on the question of Aceh. There was so much money in Aceh, billions, and it was all poured into the tsunami. And this is where the donors are. Sometimes they need to be educated. Because Aceh was such a complex situation, and the hinterland was already a place that was embroiled in conflict. The peace process provided an opportunity for really rebuilding, regrowth, and so forth. But because aid was siphoned into different pockets for the tsunami only, so you cannot help anyone who's not affected by tsunami, you actually create conflict. And it's actually going through a lot of problems now. What they were looking for is private sector to come in and invest in the resources that are there. So, you know, right now you see China coming in, for example, to look at, you know, the gas production in Aceh. So I think that in any post-crisis situation, or even the importance of private sector to come in to look at livelihood development, in sharing practices. They were dying for Felda to come and teach them how to manage plantations, for example. So here are opportunities that I think will really rebuild, and also it becomes part of peace building.
Thank you, Dr. Jemilah. And Professor, just before you get in there are a couple of questions, and I think maybe we can also respond to that, perhaps, as you're looking at it. One, I think, Jemilah, you started to answer it, but there was a comment made from the floor that it's actually the public sector and the international community that have the wherewithal, the logistical experience and expertise and responsibility, therefore, to deal with disasters, and not so much the private sector. So there was a comment from a friend from Bangladesh, who, and I would like you to respond to that. Also, on the question of larger organizations and smaller organizations, there was a question as to what extent larger corporations can actually play a role in helping smaller charities manage their business processes, etc. So if you could try and respond to those two as well, that would be good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I fully agree what our colleague from Bangladesh said. Actually, the main role is of the government. The government is responsible for the overall disaster management system in a given country. There is no doubt. So government is responsible for everything, but government alone cannot do everything. And now in all over the world, in almost all countries, the role of the government is decreasing, and the role of the NGOs, or you can say civil society, is actually increasing. And that is also logical in the sense that they have access to the grassroots level, to the community level, so that they can go and convince the community, not only in disaster management, but in all field. NGOs play a vital role in managing everything. That is what various studies have found so far. And regarding this private sector involvement in disaster management, there are 2-3 very crucial things. Number one, I should say, could be the tax. You see, say, for example, some studies have shown that some business houses, business entrepreneurs, they did not wanted to reveal their name, the name of their factory, company, or the individual, so that they will not be in trouble later on by the government. Maybe they have to pay more taxes. So that is one concern. For that, there is also one suggestion from the studies. There was one suggestion that the government should try to compensate, should try to waive the taxes for the donated money. So these are very tricky and very important issues to bring private sector into play in disaster management system as a whole. That is why there are so many untapped resources with the private sectors, which we have not been able to tap, not only for disaster management, but also for other sectors as well. Therefore, we have to, as I briefly mentioned during my presentation, that the government, the NGOs, and the society should try to motivate, should try to convince the private sector, should try to convince them that this is their moral obligation, this is their responsibility towards the society, so that they can help their own people in the time of need. So that is the most important thing that we have to do. As I gave you the example that 2 years before we organized a half-day interaction program, and we invited all big business houses, bankers, and other entrepreneurs. And the biggest question, and the important question was that what is the benefit for them? And we could not assure them. We had the answer, but probably we are not able to convince them that this is what you get. But the most important thing they get is admiration. The people will be obliged to them if they help in due time. You see, as I said, during the time of disaster, during disasters, of course, they help the people and the disaster-affected population, but not for the mitigation, preparedness, rehabilitation, and reconstruction, which is highly needed. So I won't like to go in detail due to the time constraints, because we just saw that we have 1 minute's time left. So before I forgot, actually I had to thank in the beginning, I forgot. So taking this opportunity, I would like to thank and express my kind gratitude to the organizer of this great event, particularly to the WIEF Foundation, the Malaysian government, and all the sponsors and supporters of this great event. I really enjoyed here, and this is of course one of the biggest event I ever attended. So on behalf of my organization and myself, and also from the on behalf of my country of Nepal also, I would like to thank everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, panelists. I had hoped that we would have time for another round of questions, but I think the big signs are there for everyone to see, so I suppose we ought to wrap it up. That said, of course, we're all available over coffee or tea to chat some more. I think that it is critically important to understand that disasters, natural or otherwise, are events that affect us all. And therefore, it is not only a moral responsibility for all of us to respond, to find a way to participate, not just in terms of throwing money, but really coming up with ideas, innovations, and expertise. It's not only a moral responsibility, but as we've all been saying, it just makes perfect business sense. And for those of you who are from the private sector, I suspect that would resonate very well. It does make finally perfect business sense. And ultimately, the response must start well before the response. In other words, let us all prepare, let us all find ways to reduce the risk. As I said at the beginning, an event is only an event. But it becomes a disaster when there's an impact on human life. So just imagine if there was a cyclone or a hurricane or a typhoon in the middle of the oceans and there was nobody there. There was no island, there was no ship, there was nobody there. Well, it's just an event. Nothing happened, and it's not a disaster. But you then put a ship there in the middle of the typhoon, and of course then it becomes a hazard to the ship. But if the ship is built in such a way, if the people who are steering the ship know how to navigate and nothing actually happens to the ship or the passengers, it's still not a disaster. It was an event, it was a hazard, there was a risk, but nothing really happened. So it really is up to us. You can see the difference. Sandy had an enormous economic impact, but thankfully only few human lives were lost. On the other hand, in my own country, the tsunami happened, or in Myanmar when I was there, almost 140,000 people died. And the question is, if we were all prepared, all of us, not just the government or the international community, could we have saved many, if not all of those lives? That is fundamentally a question that you must all of you ask yourselves as you go back to your businesses or to your regular lives, because unfortunately, a disaster is just around the corner. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much to Mr. Sanaka Samarasinha, as well as to the speakers. And to record this auspicious occasion, we'd like to invite the speakers for a photograph session for the record.